Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the audio space where we take a massive stack of source material, dense reports, theological treatises, intricate geopolitical analysis, and extract the most fascinating, essential insights. The goal is simple, really. We want you, the listener, to be fully informed without having to do all the heavy lifting of reading hundreds of pages of technical documents yourself.
Which, trust me, takes a lot of time.
Oh, yeah. Tons of time. Okay, let's unpack this because today's mission is unlike anything we have tackled before. We are bringing together two radically different texts that are looking at the exact same historical moment.
Right.
The first source is a highly technical geopolitical analysis titled Ukraine's EU Accession Under Fire, Alignment as Irreversibility Under Emergency.
Very academic title.
Very. And the second source is a sharp theological critique titled The Illusion of Earthly Alignment, a reformed critique of Ukraine's EU accession and the sovereign kingdom of Christ. So our mission for this deep dive is to examine the rigorous, real-world mechanics of a nation attempting to join the European Union while fighting a massive war, and then, and this is the unique part of, be that specific situation through the theological lens of Reformed Protestantism and the Westminster Confession.
Right, and before we jump into the details of all that, I need to establish a crucial baseline for you.
Good idea.
The sources we are discussing today contain strong political and geopolitical viewpoints regarding the European Union, Eastern Europe, and Western democratic alignment.
Very strong.
Yeah, so I want to state clearly that neither of us is taking a side on the political issues presented, nor are we endorsing the specific political critiques found in these texts.
Right. We are just the messengers here.
Precisely. We are strictly reporting impartially on the arguments provided in the source material to help you understand the original author's ideas. Our focus is purely on the synthesis of the information provided. We are looking at the structural arguments these authors make.
I appreciate you setting that baseline. It keeps our focus on the text itself.
Yeah.
So let's set the geopolitical scene.
Okay.
It is early 2026. Ukraine completed its official European Union screening process in late 2025. And right now, Kyiv is frantically rushing to open specific negotiation clusters to formalize its path into the bloc. The sheer timeline presented in the geopolitical sources, well, it's staggering.
It really is.
Look at this. They applied for EU membership in February 2022. That is literally days after the invasion began.
Right.
Then they gained candidate status in June 2022.
Which is light speed for Brussels.
Oh, absolutely. Then they opened formal talks in June 2024 and finished the bilateral screening by September 2025.
Yeah.
And now they are pushing hard to open clusters 1, 2, and 6.
Which cover the fundamentals, internal market, and external relations.
Right. To put that in perspective for you, the normal timeline for this kind of bureaucratic integration usually takes the better part of a decade.
If not longer.
Yeah, if not longer. They're trying to compress a marathon into a 100-meter dash, all while dodging literal artillery fire.
The speed of that timeline is unprecedented in modern European history. But our theological source presents a stark counter-narrative to all of this frantic diplomatic motion.
Yeah, it takes a totally different angle.
It does. While the secular world views integration into Western economic coalitions as a guarantee of peace and a way to secure a national future, the Reformed text approaches the situation by asking a strict homiletical question.
Which is?
What does the text say?
Right.
The author points directly to Christ's declaration in John 18.36, where he states that his kingdom is not of this world.
Right. If his kingdom were of this world, his servants would have been fighting.
Spot on. The text uses this verse to set up a massive contrast. We are watching a nation fight an existential war to join an earthly, secular kingdom, the European Union, while the biblical text insists that true security and true peace belong to a kingdom that operates on entirely different principles.
The contrast is striking. Let's look at how the EU actually operates, though. They use a strict fundamentals first rule.
Yeah, they don't mess around with that.
No, they don't. The geopolitical text explains that the EU requires political stability, the rule of law, and a functioning market economy.
The Copenhagen criteria.
Right, established back in 1993. So joining the EU is not just signing a piece of paper or, taking a group photo at a summit.
Far from it.
It is a long-form audit of preparedness. A country must prove, under immense pressure, that it can govern flawlessly.
Yeah.
It's like trying to get your kitchen to pass a surprise health inspection from the strictest municipal board on earth, except half your staff is missing and the building is structurally compromised.
That is a great analogy.
Thanks. The EU Commission sends these technical missions, they perform an intensive screening exercise, And they scrutinize the laws, the courts, the financial markets, down to the smallest regulatory details.
What's fascinating here is how the theological source contrasts the EU's strict requirements with the biblical view of human institutions.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, the Reformed author views human empires as shifting sands built entirely on the myth of human progress. The text explicitly contrasts these earthly alliances with the eternal kingdom of Christ, referencing the stone cut without hands from the second chapter of Daniel.
Oh, Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
Right. In that prophetic vision, King Nebuchadnezzar sees a massive, terrifying statue representing all the great human empires of history: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome.
Right.
But then, a stone cut without human hands strikes the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and the entire magnificent structure shatters into dust.
Then the wind blows it away.
Yeah, and the stone then grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. So the secular audit demands administrative perfection from human government, while the theological view insists that no human government, no matter how well audited, can ever achieve true righteousness or permanence.
You can really notice the tension between the physical and the spiritual here.
Yeah.
On one hand, there is a very real, urgent physical need for a geopolitical shield against aggression. You have a nation under daily bombardment. Seeking allies and economic stability makes absolute sense from a survival standpoint.
Of course.
But on the other hand, the theological text warns of the spiritual danger of viewing that earthly shield as an ultimate savior.
Yes.
Like the difference between buying an umbrella because it is raining and worshiping the umbrella as the creator of the weather.
That's a good way to put it.
We need practical tools to survive. But when we elevate those administrative tools to the level of salvation, we cross into idolatry. The geopolitical text talks about this long-form audit, but let's be honest, meeting these criteria takes time that Ukraine doesn't feel it has. They need the umbrella right now.
And if we take that concept of the EU's exhaustive audit and elevate it to the highest courtroom of heaven, we move into one of the most compelling arguments made in the theological text.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. The author looks at a specific geopolitical proposal being floated right now, known as reverse enlargement, and evaluates it through the doctrine of justification. This is where the synthesis of these two texts becomes incredibly sharp. We are moving from the halls of Brussels straight into the theology of the Reformation.
Let's define reverse enlargement for you, the listener, so
Yeah.
we're all on the same page.
Good call.
The geopolitical source describes it as a desperate administrative proposal. The idea is to grant Ukraine political EU membership by 2027. They want to give them a seat at the table, a political voice, and the security blanket of being part of the club.
Right.
However, the strict legal and economic alignments, those Copenhagen criteria we just talked about, would be fulfilled retrospectively over the following years.
Retrospectively.
Yes, it is essentially saying you belong to the club now, we will give you the membership card, but you have to finish doing the homework and passing the background checks later.
Which is a massive departure from how the European Union traditionally operates.
Yeah, normally you don't get the membership card until every single box is checked.
The theological text heavily critiques this idea, not from a political standpoint, but from a dogmatic one.
Okay.
The Reformed author argues that the halls of Brussels are presenting a flawed human analogy of the biblical doctrine of justification. The secular proposal of reverse enlargement is an attempt to grant a state of belonging before the conditions are fully met, but it still maintains the threat of punishment if those conditions are not eventually satisfied.
So it's conditional.
Highly conditional. The EU is essentially offering a probationary status.
Right, because the EU demands an arduous administrative sanctification of the state. If the nation fails to maintain alignment with those rigid Copenhagen criteria over the next 5 or 10 years, their privileges are stripped away.
Yeah.
Their funding gets frozen. Their voting rights can be suspended. You are in, but you are constantly proving you deserve to stay in.
The theological text points out that the EU model is inescapably a covenant of works.
Okay, unpack that term for us.
A covenant of works relies entirely on human merit, continuous performance, and the perpetual threat of penalization. If you fail the audit, you lose the grace.
Got it.
By absolute contrast, biblical justification is a covenant of grace. The text details the Greek verb for justify, dikaio. The author highlights its forensic nature, particularly as it appears in Romans 5.1, which says, Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Forensic justification.
Right, meaning it happens in a courtroom setting. It does not mean to make someone internally good over a prolonged, imperfect period of legislative reform. It means to declare someone legally righteous instantly, based solely on the imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ.
So the secular concept of political union is trying to offer immediate belonging before perfect compliance is reached, which superficially looks a bit like the gospel.
It does look like it on the surface.
It mimics how the gospel offers immediate union with Christ before a believer's practical sanctification is completed. When a person becomes a Christian, they are instantly justified, even though they still struggle with sin.
Exactly right. Well, spot on, I should say.
But the massive difference is that the EU expects the state to generate its own righteousness eventually. Brussels says, we will let you in now, but you better clean up your own act.
Yes.
The gospel says Christ provides the perfect record for you because you can never clean up your own act. The theological text shares a phenomenal quote from Charles Spurgeon that makes this so relatable for you.
Oh, the Spurgeon quote is fantastic.
Spurgeon said, if my salvation rested upon my own keeping of the law, I should be damned tomorrow.
That quote perfectly illustrates the failure of the human analogy. Brussels demands a righteousness that an unregenerate state simply cannot inherently produce. The covenant of works demands flawless execution, which is impossible for fallen humanity. Whether it is a single person trying to be perfect, or an entire nation of millions of people trying to eliminate all corruption and run a perfect market economy, the result is the same.
Failure.
Right. The covenant of grace rests entirely on the flawless execution of Christ on behalf of the believer. The theological text warns us not to project our desperate need for grace onto secular institutions that are incapable of providing it. The EU cannot justify a nation. It can only audit it.
Okay, let's unpack this further. So what does this all mean for the actual laws being passed in Kyiv right now?
Yeah, that's the real ground level issue.
How does this massive theological concept crash into the daily reality of wartime legislation? This leads us directly into the first specific pillar of EU alignment, discussed in the geopolitical text Pillar 1, which focuses on institutional guardrails under emergency.
The geopolitical text highlights a severe tension here. Wartime demands speed, secrecy, and command-style governance.
Naturally.
When a missile is incoming, you do not form a committee to discuss the budget for the air defense system. You act immediately.
Right.
But the EU demands independent courts, predictable administration, public consultations, and rigorous oversight. They want the bureaucratic machinery to grind along slowly and perfectly, ensuring no funds are misused and no executive overreach occurs.
The perfect test case for this tension occurred in July 2025.
I remember this section.
The geopolitical source details a major crisis where the Ukrainian parliament passed a law that dismantled safeguards for two major anti-corruption bodies.
MEU and SAPO.
Right. MEBU, which is the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and SAPO, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. These two acronyms are the absolute darlings of Western donors.
Because they are supposed to be completely independent.
Supposed to be. But this new law placed their operational work under the authority of a politically appointed prosecutor general. It was a massive stress test of those guardrails.
Yeah, it was.
Parliament essentially said, we are in a war, we need centralized control, we cannot have rogue independent bureaus complicating things.
And how did the West react?
Not well. Following intense domestic pressure from civil society and massive outcries from Western financial backers who threatened to withhold funds, President Zelensky swiftly restored their autonomy. The crisis was averted, but the fragility of the system was exposed for everyone to see.
The theological text examines this precise dynamic through the reformed lens of total depravity.
Okay, how so?
The author asks what specific sins of our time this legislative battle confronts, pointing directly to greed, bribery, and the idol of political pragmatism.
Right.
The reformed view holds that unregenerate nations are driven by pure self-interest. Total depravity doesn't mean every person is as evil as they could possibly be at all times. It means that every aspect of human nature, our minds, our wills, our desires, is tainted by sin. Because human nature is totally depraved, the civil magistrate is ordained by God to maintain outward order. We need laws, courts, and independent anti-corruption bureaus because people will naturally steal, cheat, and consolidate power if left to their own devices.
this brings up a concept you might hear called exception logic.
Oh, that's an interesting phrase.
Yeah, the geopolitical text warns against using national security as a catch-all alibi for permanent impunity. It warns that extraordinary procedures can quietly convert emergency governance into permanent corruption.
We see that all the time in history.
Right. A government takes emergency powers during a crisis, and then somehow the crisis never quite ends, and they never quite give the powers back.
Exactly. Or rather, yeah, that is the pattern.
The theological text agrees entirely with this skepticism, stating that humanistic optimism is a delusion. Unregenerate man cannot simply legislate away the corruption of the human heart. You cannot write a law that makes a public official stop loving money.
No, you can't.
You can only write a law that punishes him if he gets caught taking it.
That is a critical observation. The Reformed framework looks at human governance with a healthy skepticism. The civil magistrate is necessary because of sin, not because humanity is progressing toward a utopia.
Right.
The theological text references the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, concerning providence. God sovereignly ordains the shifting borders, economic treaties, and geopolitical alliances to restrain the sheer wickedness of men.
So he uses these earthly systems.
Yes, the confession teaches that God's providence extends to all things, from the fall of an empire to the passing of a local anti-corruption law. He uses these earthly mechanisms to keep the world from descending into absolute anarchy.
So the EU's efforts to demand independent courts and anti-corruption bureaus can actually be seen as a mechanism of common grace.
Yes, precisely.
God uses these secular institutions, these massive auditing frameworks, to maintain order and protect people from worse outcomes. Common grace is the goodness God shows to all people, regardless of whether they are believers. It is the rain falling on the just and the unjust.
But there is a caveat.
What's the caveat?
The theological source strictly warns against confusing common grace with saving grace. A well-functioning anti-corruption bureau might stop a bribe, and that is a good thing for society, but it cannot save a soul. It cannot reconcile a sinner to a holy God.
That makes sense.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see how the theological abstract applies directly to the geopolitical reality. The EU is demanding a level of administrative purity that pushes against the gravitational pull of human depravity.
This is an uphill battle.
A steep one. The guardrails are necessary exactly because, or rather primarily because, human nature cannot be trusted with unchecked authority, especially in the chaos of a war. The European Union knows that without independent oversight, the billions of euros flowing into the country will inevitably be subject to graft. They don't need a theological doctrine of total depravity to observe the practical reality of human greed.
Which moves us from the guardrails to the actual output expected by Brussels.
Yeah.
Let's look in Pillar 2, administrative results under pressure.
Okay, Pillar 2.
The geopolitical text is clear that the EU expects consistent, auditable enforcement. They do not just want good laws on the books. They want to see the receipts.
You want proof.
Yeah. It's one thing to pass a law saying bribery is illegal. It is an entirely different thing to prosecute a high-ranking official during a national crisis. Brussels wants to see the system actually working, catching criminals, and recovering funds.
The focus shifts from theoretical alignment to practical execution. The geopolitical source highlights public procurement as the highest risk area.
Huge risk.
When a nation is spending billions on military supplies, food, and infrastructure reconstruction at lightning speed, the temptation for kickbacks is astronomical.
The text mentions a glaring example from April 2025. Authorities brought charges regarding a high-profile military food procurement scheme and drone kickbacks.
Yeah, that was a major scandal.
The kickbacks allegedly reached massive percentages of the contract values. We are talking about people skimming money off the top of food contracts meant for soldiers on the front lines.
Which is horrifying.
It is. To combat this, Ukraine utilizes a digital system called Prozoro to maintain transparency.
Prozoro?
Yeah, Prozoro makes tender data public so civil society, journalists, and average citizens can scrutinize the bids. Anyone with an internet connection can look up who got the contract for military rations and see if the price matches the market rate.
Transparency is key.
Right. And funding from the EU is managed through the Ukraine facility, a massive financial mechanism that strictly ties disbursements to specific auditable reform milestones. If you don't hit the milestone, you don't get the next tranche of cash.
And here we find another brilliant intersection with the theological text. The secular world is tying economic interdependence to the promise of peace.
Okay, how so?
The European Union operates on the belief that shared markets, transparent digital procurement systems, and intense financial oversight will create lasting stability. The secular world views peace similarly to the Greco-Roman concept of eireno, a temporary cessation of hostilities backed by military and economic might. It is very much akin to the Pax Romana.
Wait, let's pause on the Pax Romana for a second. The Pax Romana was not true harmony, right?
No, not at all.
It was just the Roman Empire being so massively dominant, so heavily armed, and so economically integrated that nobody dared to start a rebellion because they knew they would be crushed.
Right.
It was peace through superior firepower and economic monopolization.
Precisely. It was the absence of visible conflict due to intimidation and mutual financial reliance. The text contrasts this earthly, pragmatic peace with New Testament eirone, which denotes an objective, unbreakable legal standing of reconciliation with God.
Oh, that's a big shift in definition.
Huge shift. The biblical text makes a deliberate, inspired choice here. The Holy Spirit could have used the Greek word spondo, which means a political truce, a ceasefire, or a bilateral treaty between warring factions. Yes. If the gospel were merely about stopping human conflicts, spondo would have been the perfect word. But the Spirit chose eireno to show that true peace is exclusively the fruit of divine justification, not a geopolitical ceasefire. True peace is the settling of the ultimate hostility between a holy God and sinful man.
You can really see the friction between these two worldviews. The EU requires a sort of civic sanctification.
Yes, that's a good phrase.
They want Ukraine to behave perfectly, to audit every single cent of that military food contract, to have pristine public procurement through the Prozoro system, but they expect this flawless moral behavior without the spiritual prerequisite of justification by faith alone.
They want the fruit without the root.
Exactly. They want the fruits of righteousness without the root of a regenerate heart.
Yeah.
The theological text quotes the Puritans, comparing societal reform without the new birth to rearranging the furniture in a burning house.
Such a vivid image.
Isn't it? You might make the living room look incredibly tidy, you might stop the drone kickbacks, but the house is still going to burn down because the foundational issue hasn't been addressed.
That Puritan analogy is devastatingly accurate within the Reformed framework. The State Audit Service is constantly liaising with the European Court of Auditors. This massive bureaucratic machine is designed to trace funds down to the cent, proving that earthly institutions demand an incredibly high standard of works.
Right.
They are trying to build a flawless system with flawed human material. They are demanding transparency from hearts that are naturally deceitful. While the audits are necessary for the temporal functioning of the state, the theological text reminds us that no amount of financial transparency can produce a society that is truly at peace.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Pillar 3 takes this concept of auditing and rule following and moves it into raw physical reality.
Okay, let's hear about Pillar 3.
The geopolitical text outlines Pillar 3 as systems integration. This is not just about passing laws or uploading contracts to a digital database. This is about Ukraine physically plugging into European processes before official membership is even granted.
Meaning what, exactly? Or rather, specifically?
They are hardwiring their nation into the continent.
Systems integration moves the concept of alignment from the theoretical to the tangible. We are no longer just talking about shared values. We are talking about shared electricity.
Yeah. The geopolitical text provides key examples of this deep integration.
Let's look at those examples.
In October 2025, they implemented the Upgraded Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, or DCFTA.
DCFTA?
Right. This means massive amounts of tariffs are dropped and goods flow across the border, almost as if the border isn't there. Then, going back to March 2022, right as the invasion began, there was an emergency synchronization of the Ukrainian power grid with the continental European grid, known as NTAE.
That is a massive undertaking.
Oh, massive. They literally unplugged their electrical grid from the old Soviet network and plugged it into Europe. And by October 2025, Ukraine achieved 99% alignment with EU foreign policy statements. They're wiring their electricity, their trade, and their foreign policy directly into the European mainframe. It is an astonishing level of physical and diplomatic merging.
To analyze this through the theological lens, the author introduces the analogy of faith principle.
What's that?
This is the historic Reformed hermeneutical rule that Scripture must interpret Scripture. You do not interpret a confusing passage of the Bible in isolation. You look at the clear passages to shed light on the obscure ones.
That makes sense.
The author views this massive integration of physical and political systems through a premillennial and dispensational framework. In this view, the current age is characterized by wars and rumors of wars, as stated in Matthew 24:7.
Let me make sure I'm following this. So while the European Union is frantically trying to wire everything together, the power grids, the trade routes, the foreign policy, to create an unbreakable grid of peace and mutual reliance, the biblical text says this entire era of human history is fundamentally defined by conflict.
Right.
The secular world says, if we just integrate enough, we will end war. The biblical text says, until Christ returns, war is a permanent feature of the human condition.
Yes, the theological text goes even further into the prophetic implications. The integration of European power is compared directly to the prophetic visions of Daniel 2.
Back to the statue.
Right. The scramble for alignment among former Roman sphere nations is seen as an echo of the feat of iron and clay. It is a fragile coalition built on human diplomacy, economic treaties, and shared electrical grids, rather than a divine covenant. Iron and clay can be mixed together in a mold, but they will never truly bond. They remain distinct and brittle.
Iron and clay do not mix. They might look incredibly solid for a moment, especially from a distance. They might look like a unified European front, but hit them with a hammer of economic stress or geopolitical panic, and they shatter. The theological text asks you to consider the prosperity gospel of secularism.
That is such a striking phrase.
It really is. It mandates guarding against the idea that the Eurozone or Western alliances can function as a messianic arrival of permanent peace. The prosperity gospel in a religious sense says, if you have enough faith, God will make you rich and healthy.
Right.
The secular version says, if you have enough democratic integration, the EU will make you safe and wealthy.
The prosperity gospel of secularism is a brilliant distillation of the modern Western mindset. It promises that if a nation just aligns with the right economic bloc, signs the correct treaties, and wires its power grid to the right neighbors, it will be saved from suffering and historical tragedy.
But the geopolitical text itself provides immediate evidence of the iron and clay fragility. The system is already showing cracks under pressure.
Let's talk about those cracks.
Absolutely. The geopolitical source talks about the emergency brake mechanism used by the EU. When Ukrainian agricultural products, things like oats, eggs, sugar, and honey, started flooding the European market because of that free trade agreement, it caused massive domestic backlash among European farmers.
Understandably so, from their perspective.
Right. Farmers in neighboring countries were suddenly undercut by cheaper Ukrainian goods. They protested, they blocked border crossings, they demanded action. So the EU pulled the emergency brake to stop those imports.
Which perfectly illustrates the iron and clay point.
It does. The earthly treaties easily fracture under economic pressure. The grand vision of continental solidarity only lasted until local farmers got angry about the price of eggs. When local economies are threatened, the grand ideals of integration are quickly suspended.
This internal fracturing is not just economic, it is highly political. The geopolitical text notes that the enlargement process is a massive test for the European Union itself. The Union is struggling to maintain its own cohesion while trying to absorb a massive war-torn nation. The strain is revealing the inherent weaknesses of a system built on human consensus.
This brings us to Section 6, the Union under fire. Let's look at how the machinery of Brussels is actually handling this.
Okay.
The enlargement process requires conditionality. It is supposed to be entirely merit-based. If you hit the benchmarks, you move forward.
Yeah.
But internal veto politics complicate everything. The geopolitical text notes that in October 2025, Hungary blocked Ukraine from opening those thematic clusters we discussed earlier.
Right.
And by February 2026, EU leaders were accusing Hungary of using energy disputes as leverage to obstruct vital sanctions and financing.
So a single member state can freeze the entire accession process for reasons that are completely unrelated to Ukraine's actual reform progress.
Yeah.
Ukraine could pass every single audit, implement flawless anti-corruption measures, and align perfectly with the Copenhagen criteria. And one nation's veto could still halt the entire process. This exposes the fundamental flaw in the administrative salvation the EU offers. It is subject to the whims and political leverage of individual, self-interested actors.
Wait, so let me get this straight. They want to bypass the single nation veto because one country can hold up the whole continent. How does that even work legally?
It's tricky.
The geopolitical text mentions that to bypass this gridlock, policymakers are suggesting something called phasing. This means granting staged access to the single market based on specific benchmarks, rather than waiting for full membership.
Staged access.
Yeah, and they're even discussing implementing qualified majority voting, or QMV, to bypass these single-nation vetoes entirely. This means you wouldn't need unanimous consent anymore. A sufficiently large majority could overrule the dissenting country.
That would change everything.
This system is straining so hard under its own rules that they are trying to rewrite the foundational rules of the Union just to keep the process moving.
This is where the theological application comes to the forefront with incredible clarity. For you, the weary listener watching this global machine grind, stall, and strain under its own weight, the theological text demands a response in three specific areas: head, heart, and hands.
Head, heart, and hands. I love frameworks like that.
The author is taking all of this geopolitical chaos and making it intensely personal and practical for the believer.
It breaks down massive, abstract ideas into daily application. What does that look like in practice for someone reading the news about EU vetoes and power grid integration?
Well, the mind or the head must believe that Christ's sovereignty transcends Brussels treaties. It is the intellectual recognition that no matter what happens with qualified majority voting or agricultural emergency breaks, the true king is on his throne. The heart must feel a holy detachment from false earthly securities. It is the emotional discipline of not panicking when an alliance fractures and not rejoicing too much when a treaty is signed, knowing both are temporary. The hands must labor for a kingdom that cannot be shaken. This means engaging in the daily work of Christian obedience, local church service, and charity, recognizing that these eternal investments outlast any geopolitical maneuver. The text calls out specific modern sins that tempt us in this fraught geopolitical moment.
I see. It calls out pragmatism that seeks secular compromise.
Yeah.
That is the temptation to say, let's just do whatever works, even if it violates our principles, because the situation is an emergency.
A very common trap.
It calls out mysticism that looks for signs in the headlines rather than resting in Scripture. That's when people start trying to decode every news alert about the EU or Russia as a specific fulfillment of a Bible verse, causing unnecessary panic.
Which happens a lot online.
Oh, all the time. And it calls out the liberal philosophy that trusts in legislation for salvation. That is the belief that if we just get the right people into office and pass the perfect anti-corruption laws, we can create heaven on earth.
The contrast in the instructions given to the individual is sharp. The world, speaking through the geopolitical source, says, align with the union and be secure.
Pass the audit.
Right. Pass the audit, sync the power grid, open the negotiation clusters, implement the digital transparency systems, and you will be safe from your enemies. But Christ says, abide in me, for without me you can do nothing.
Yeah.
The secular worldview places the burden of security entirely on human effort and administrative alignment. The biblical worldview places security entirely in a living union with the Creator.
The geopolitical source is entirely focused on the political sanctification of the state. Can Ukraine meet Brussels standards? Can they pass the test?
Yes.
But the Reform text, particularly from an eschatological perspective, argues that the primary concern should not be the state's alignment, but the spiritual preparation of the saints.
The author brings in a pre-tribulational perspective to solidify this point. The focus is on cultivating patient endurance in light of the blessed hope.
The blessed hope.
The blessed hope refers to the return of Christ to gather his church. The fragility of the EU, the politically motivated vetoes from member states, the emergency breaks on agriculture, the constant threat of corruption, all of these are providential reminders that human systems will fail.
They are designed to show us that.
Yes. They are designed by God to show us that the iron and clay cannot hold the weight of our eternal hopes. The believer is called to patiently endure this chaotic era, knowing that the stone cut without hands is the only true and lasting kingdom.
So, to tie this massive discussion together, where does this leave you, the listener, living in a world of geopolitical chaos? Let's summarize what we've learned from both of these dense perspectives.
Good idea.
Synthesizing the geopolitical reality, we see that wartime alignment is a grueling, almost impossible test. It requires convergence that can survive extreme emergency incentives. A state must build independent institutions, measurable administrative routines, and deep physical systems interoperability to prove it can handle the immense burden of EU membership, all while under literal bombardment.
Right.
It is a demonstration of human resilience. But it is also a system fraught with political leverage, vetoes, and economic protectionism.
And synthesizing the theological reality, we see that earthly treaties and international unions are a providential means of restraining evil via common grace. They are necessary for temporal order.
We need them.
We should prefer the rule of law over anarchy. However, they remain temporary bulwarks. They are not the ultimate solution to the human condition. True legal alignment, true peace, is only found in union with Christ by grace alone, not through the chariots and horses of modern diplomacy.
Yeah.
The European Union can offer a temporary Pax Romana, but it can never offer the eternal Iruno of justification.
The technocratic audit versus the sovereign decree. Two completely different ways of measuring a nation's standing.
This raises an important question for you. Where do you hold your primary citizenship? Both texts challenge you, though in very different ways.
Also,
The geopolitical text challenges you to understand the sheer difficulty of maintaining democratic institutions under fire. The theological text challenges you to rest in the absolute decree and providence of God over all nations, looking toward the New Jerusalem rather than placing your highest hope in any earthly capital, whether that is Kiev, Brussels, or Washington.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We have talked a lot about how the civil magistrate is ordained by common grace to restrain evil. We need laws to keep the chaos at bay.
Right.
But what happens when the administrative tools of human government become so technologically integrated, like synchronized power grids, unified digital currencies, and absolute legislative alignment, that they demand the very allegiance reserved only for the kingdom of heaven?
That's a massive question.
When the system becomes so perfect at tracking every cent and demanding total compliance, does it leave any room for dissent? Will the systems built to protect us eventually become the idols that trap us? It is something to keep a close eye on as these massive geopolitical shifts continue to unfold.
A sobering thought, and one that aligns perfectly with the theological warnings we have discussed today regarding the limits of human governance.
Thank you for joining this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We hope this synthesis of geopolitics and theology has given you a clearer picture of the world right now. Keep asking questions, keep studying, and always verify what the text actually says. Until next time.